The Galactic Empire sat in a vast room high above the galaxy where the brightest minds of the Empire gathered to decide the fate of a small blue planet in a distant system. The humans called Earth. The planet was insignificant by their standards, located on the outer rim of the galaxy, where the Empire had little interest, yet their scouts had begun to report an anomaly, a species that seemed to be developing faster than expected despite being primitive and scattered across their homeworld. They were no threat, or so they thought at first. Their technology was behind, and their political systems fragmented. They lacked the unity of a true galactic power and had no way of resisting the overwhelming might of the Empire. The decision was swift and made by one of the highest imperial councils. That Earth was to be brought into submission or eradicated. It was a simple choice for a planet so far from imperial authority. After all, the Empire had crushed entire civilizations that had once believed they could resist the might of the galactic forces, and Earth was nothing more than a minor nuisance on their radar. But there was something more to the humans than the Empire cared to notice, something that was about to make the greatest mistake of their long history. Admiral Vorik, one of the Empire's most seasoned tacticians, was chosen to lead the task force that would carry out the mission. The mission was straightforward. Earth would either kneel before imperial rule or be obliterated. Vorik had seen countless species fall to the might of the Empire, and was sure the humans would be no different. In fact, he found their history and culture laughable, primitive, and irrelevant. It wasn't until he received his orders that he thought to himself, why even bother negotiating? They were just humans, a species that barely knew how to communicate beyond their planet. Yet there was a small spark of curiosity within him. What was it that made them so persistent in their attempts to grow beyond their natural limits? The reports from his scouts were clear. Earth had been trying to reach the stars for centuries, but had failed miserably. Their technology, still limited to rockets and crude instruments that barely worked outside their atmosphere. But there was something in their will, something in their desire to climb higher, even if they had no wings to fly. Vorik dismissed the thought and focused on the task at hand. The Empire's intelligence had already prepared the message. It would be a simple transmission sent to the humans, demanding their immediate surrender in exchange for their survival. Admiral Vorik and his fleet would arrive above Earth and wait for their response. If they resisted, the Empire's might would sweep across their world in a matter of hours. But something gnawed at the Admiral's mind as his fleet made the jump to Earth's system. The humans had never encountered such power before. Would they truly submit, or would they do something unexpected? He hated that thought and dismissed it as he watched the stars streak by as his ships closed in on their target. Soon Earth would be nothing more than a footnote in the Empire's great history. The fleet of the Galactic Empire arrived in orbit around Earth in the dead of night. The darkened sky above the planet twinkled with stars, unnoticed by the millions below who slept unaware of the threat descending upon them. Admiral Vorik watched from the bridge of his flagship, a colossal warship that radiated an almost palpable arrogance. The humans had been informed of the Empire's arrival. Their leaders would know what was coming, but Vorik couldn't help but feel a slight disturbance, a small spark of intrigue, as the ship's sensors detected a strange lack of activity. No panicked broadcasts, no desperate attempts to organize a defense, just silence, a deep, unnatural silence. As Vorik's warship entered Earth's atmosphere with a calculated grace, he received the transmission. It was a single message from Earth's government. Deverlina Hayes, a human diplomat, a woman whose reputation was one of reason and negotiation in a world that had been fractured by war and conflict. She wasn't the leader of Earth, but her role as negotiator had brought her to the attention of the Empire as the sole representative of humanity. She calmly and confidently requested a meeting with Admiral Vorik. She spoke of diplomacy and mutual understanding, but her voice lacked the fear Vorik expected. The humans were supposed to tremble at the sight of an empire that had conquered countless worlds, yet Dr. Hayes's voice carried no fear, just a calm acceptance that struck the Admiral as odd. He found it unsettling. He expected humans to beg for mercy, to fall to their knees, not offer a chance at dialogue. Vorik's first instinct was to dismiss the request and order the planetary bombardment to begin immediately, but something held him back. There was a strange respect among the Empire's command for the process of communication before annihilation, and his own curiosity got the better of him. as he ordered the meeting to take place within the hour on the surface of Earth in a neutral location. A small facility on the outskirts of a major city was chosen, and within moments Dr. Hayes was escorted to the waiting shuttle that would take her to the Admiral's warship. The meeting would be brief, and her answer would be clear. She would either accept the Empire's terms or refuse, and face the consequences. Dr. Hayes arrived aboard the warship with a calm demeanor, her eyes focused with a purpose that unnerved even the most hardened officers aboard Vorik's flagship. She entered the conference room, where the Admiral awaited, and they exchanged a few formal pleasantries. But it didn't take long before the real conversation began. Dr. Hayes made her position clear. She spoke of Earth's people, their will to survive, and their desire for peace. But she refused to bow to the Empire's demand for subjugation. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't angry, she was simply resolute. She spoke of humanity's capacity to overcome impossible odds, to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. She didn't offer threats, just the quiet certainty that the humans wouldn't fall without a fight. Vorik was taken aback. He expected the humans to collapse under the weight of the Empire's might. But here was a woman standing before him who was unyielding. She wasn't pleading for mercy or surrendering to despair. She was standing her ground, and the Admiral realized with a creeping unease that something was very wrong. Humans weren't supposed to act this way. They were supposed to fear. They were supposed to break. But instead she stood unbroken, and the seed of doubt was planted. Admiral Vorik watched as Deverlina Hayes stood unwavering in front of him. Her words hung in the air, like a challenge that he was not prepared for. Her calm resolve gnawed at him, and he found himself unable to respond immediately. He had expected the humans to beg for mercy, to crumble under the weight of Imperial authority. But instead they showed strength and defiance, a spark of something he couldn't quite understand in the face of certain annihilation. Vorik's gaze hardened, but he had already seen enough of this strange species to realize something important. Humanity would not be easy to crush, not like the countless other worlds the Empire had swallowed whole in the past. And this realization began to shift something in the Admiral's strategy. He ordered the meeting to end abruptly, and Dr. Hayes was escorted back to Earth, her words echoing in his mind. Meanwhile, back on Earth, something remarkable was unfolding in the shadows. The Empire had miscalculated the true scope of humanity's capabilities. They had believed that Earth was still a fledgling species struggling with basic technology. But in the hidden depths of the world, beneath the surface of cities and the quiet corners of forgotten places, human ingenuity was thriving. For decades, humanity had been preparing for the possibility of an alien invasion, but not just preparing in a traditional sense. They had been studying alien technology, reverse engineering what they could, and using it to advance their own capabilities in secret. The truth was the humans had long ago begun to push the boundaries of their technological limits, and while their spacefaring ambitions had been stunted by the Empire's dominance of the galaxy, they had not stopped trying to reach the stars. Jonah, a brilliant hacker and former military strategist, had been one of the first to realize that the Empire's communication systems could be hacked from within their own network using primitive Earth tech combined with alien salvage that had been stored away for years. He and a small group of specialists had spent months working in secrecy, perfecting their plan to strike back at the invaders. The hacking group operated from an underground base beneath the Earth's surface, far from the Empire's surveillance. But within striking distance of the network they planned to exploit, Jonah's team had tapped into the Empire's satellite systems and were already in the process of scrambling the Empire's sensors, making it impossible for their fleets to track human ships. The disruption was only a temporary measure, but it was enough to buy humanity time to formulate a real response. The rest of humanity, however, remained blissfully unaware of the growing resistance beneath their feet. As the Empire's fleet orbited overhead, the Empire's arrogance blinded them to the fact that humanity was capable of more than just basic survival. Their true power lay in their creativity, their resilience, and their capacity to innovate when faced with overwhelming odds. Jonah and his team had only just begun their work, but the foundation had been set. The Empire had underestimated Earth's ability to adapt and to fight back using whatever tools were at their disposal. And that's when the first blow was struck. As the Empire's fleet tried to make their move to engage Earth's defenses, they found their systems jammed, their ships unable to communicate with each other, their sensors unreliable, and their position now uncertain. The Empire had no idea that their carefully constructed plan was already unraveling. The humans had made their first strike in the most unexpected of ways, by simply forcing the Empire to fight blind, and the seeds of rebellion were now planted across the galaxy. The Empire's fleet was thrown into chaos as its communication systems failed. One by one, ships were unable to send or receive orders, and entire battalions of soldiers found themselves stranded in space, unable to coordinate their movements or share vital information. It was a problem no one had expected, and Admiral Vorik's frustration grew with each passing minute. At first, he believed it was a simple glitch in the system, but as the minutes turned into hours and the problems worsened, he began to realize something far worse was happening. Someone was deliberately sabotaging the fleet. His eyes narrowed as he tried to figure out how the humans could have pulled off such an attack, but there was no time to waste. His fleet was already vulnerable, and the delay had given the humans the chance they needed to make their move. On Earth, the resistance grew stronger with each passing day. Small victories against the Empire turned into larger ones as the humans began to develop their own strategies and tactics. They had no hope of defeating the Empire in direct combat, but they didn't need to. They had something far more dangerous at their disposal: ingenuity, guerrilla warfare, and the one thing the Empire never took into account, their sheer will to survive. Earth's cities have become fortified strongholds as humans, armed with everything from scavenged weapons to makeshift explosives, launched hit-and-run attacks on Imperial outposts. The Empire soldiers were unprepared for the brutality of human resistance as civilian militias and underground organizations sprang up in every major city. Each group worked independently, but toward the same goal: to free Earth from the Empire's grasp. Captain Elias Kane, a former soldier turned resistance leader, became the face of this new war. His name spread like wildfire across the planet as he led daring raids against the Empire's supply lines and military installations. Kane was a man driven by the loss of his family during the initial bombing of Earth. He was a man who had nothing left to lose, but the will to fight back was something the Empire had never anticipated. The more battles Kane won, the more human forces rallied to his side. What started as small pockets of resistance grew into a full-scale war, the likes of which the Empire had never seen before. The Empire was used to quelling rebellions with ease, but this time it was different. This time, the humans weren't begging for mercy. They were fighting back with everything they had, and each battle they won only made them stronger. Vorik watched as his fleet continued to flounder in the chaos of the jamming signals. But it wasn't just the fleet that was suffering. The Empire's ground forces were also struggling to contain the human insurgency. Each strike on Earth's surface hit harder than the last. Imperial garrisons began to fall one by one, and soon the Empire's forces were stretched thin trying to maintain control over key locations across the planet. Vorik's confidence began to crack as he realized that the Empire's overwhelming might was not enough to subdue the humans. The battle was no longer a question of firepower. It was a question of endurance, and for the first time in his career, Admiral Vorik wondered if the Empire had truly made a fatal mistake by underestimating the resilience of the human spirit. As the weeks dragged on, Vorik received troubling reports from his commanders. On the ground, the situation on Earth was deteriorating rapidly. The Empire's initial advantage had slipped away, and the humans were beginning to reclaim their world bit by bit. What was supposed to be a quick and decisive victory was becoming a war of attrition, a war the Empire had never been prepared for. And as Vorik sat in his war room, he realized that the humans had outplayed them at every turn. They had taken the Empire's arrogance and used it against them. And now the Admiral found himself on the back foot, struggling to find a way to regain control of a situation that was spiraling out of his command. Admiral Vorik paced back and forth on the bridge of his flagship. The stress of the failing campaign was beginning to show. His once imposing presence was now overshadowed by doubt. The latest reports from Earth only confirmed what he had feared. Humanity's resistance was growing stronger with each passing day. The coordinated attacks against Imperial supply lines were becoming more frequent, and precise sabotage was no longer just a nuisance, it had become a constant threat. Human militias were seizing Imperial weapons from garrisons and military vehicles. From battlefields, their tactics were unpredictable and ruthless. While the Empire's forces relied on discipline and overwhelming force, the humans had learned to fight differently. They were using everything they had at their disposal in ways Vorik had never expected. The Empire's technology was advanced, but it was also rigidly structured and reliant on precision. Humanity didn't have the luxury of such order. They had to improvise and adapt. The humans' ability to turn any situation to their advantage was something the Empire had never encountered before. The use of guerrilla warfare was a concept Vorik had dismissed as primitive, but now he saw it as a calculated form of warfare. With each raid, each skirmish, the humans were learning faster than he thought possible. The more they were pushed, the harder they fought, and the more resourceful they became. And what was worse was that they weren't afraid. Vorik had thought fear would be their greatest weapon to break them. But instead, humanity's fearlessness fueled their tenacity. It was a quality the Empire had overlooked, something the Empire's commanders couldn't comprehend, because they had never fought an enemy that didn't simply cower under their might. Meanwhile, across Earth, Captain Elias Kane's influence continued to spread from the shadows of crumbling cities. He led his forces with a brutal clarity driven by vengeance and an unyielding desire for freedom. Every victory, no matter how small, was another nail in the coffin of the Empire's dominance. And with every battle won, the human resistance grew stronger and more organized. Kane's methods were unconventional and ruthless. He understood that they couldn't hope to defeat the Empire in a traditional battle, but they could wear them down. They could dismantle their supply chains, disrupt their communications, and slowly cripple the Empire's war machine. And that's exactly what they did. Kane's forces began to strike at Imperial strongholds with surgical precision, using surprise and speed to overcome overwhelming odds. They didn't face the Empire's might head-on. They avoided it, instead striking at its weakest points and retreating before the Empire could react. The damage was accumulating faster than Vorik had anticipated. Human forces were no longer just skirmishing, they were launching full-scale operations targeting Imperial infrastructure across the planet and beyond. They had disabled Imperial satellites, leaving the Empire blind to what was happening on the ground and in space. Vorik had to confront the truth. Humanity was not just a nuisance, they were a threat to the Empire's authority. And this threat was growing harder to contain by the day. Each new setback chipped away at the Empire's control, and the Admiral knew that the longer this dragged on, the more difficult it would be to regain the upper hand. But there was one thing Vorik had failed to consider, and it was something that would change the course of the entire conflict. It was not just the humans' resourcefulness or their willingness to fight, it was their capacity to inspire those around them, even in the darkest moments. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity's spirit had ignited a fire in every corner of their world and beyond. And as the conflict raged on, more and more worlds began to take notice of the human resistance. The galaxy was watching as Earth fought back, and in the deepest corners of space, the whispers of rebellion began to grow stronger. As the war on Earth raged on, something unexpected began to happen. The very tenacity and ingenuity the Empire had underestimated in humanity began to spread beyond Earth's borders. Humanity's struggle for freedom had become a symbol, a rallying cry to those worlds under the heel of the Galactic Empire. News of Earth's resistance spread through the galaxy, reaching oppressed colonies and conquered systems that had long been silenced by the Empire's iron grip. Humanity's war had become theirs too. And as they watched Earth fight back with unrelenting courage, more and more systems started to stir. Captain Elias Kane's reputation had spread far beyond Earth. His name became a symbol of hope to the oppressed, to the beaten down, who had never believed they could resist the Empire's cruelty. Humanity's example of resilience and ingenuity fueled the fires of rebellion in other star systems, from the icy worlds of Shalix Prime to the jungles of Varessa. Three long-forgotten colonies that had lived in fear under Imperial rule began to form their own resistance movements. They didn't have the technology or firepower to challenge the Empire directly, but they had something far more dangerous. They had the spirit to fight back. They had seen what Earth had done, and they began to organize in secret, drawing inspiration from the tactics and victories the humans had shown the galaxy. Back on Earth, Admiral Vorik was now fighting a two-front battle. As the resistance on Earth continued to grow stronger, so did the stirrings of rebellion throughout the galaxy. The Empire had long dominated the stars with an iron fist, but the cracks were beginning to show as colonies that had once been kept in line with brute force now found the courage to rise up. The Empire's resources were stretched thin as it tried to suppress uprisings in multiple systems. At once the once unstoppable war machine was faltering, and Vorik knew it was only a matter of time before the Empire's carefully crafted empire of fear began to crumble under the weight of its own hubris. On Earth, the resistance reached a new level of intensity as Deverlina Hayes coordinated with global leaders and military commanders to form a unified front against the Empire. They had stopped fighting in the shadows and started taking the fight to the Empire's most fortified positions. The rebels were using a mix of guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and clever misdirection to strike key targets and then disappear before the Empire could retaliate. Their attacks were becoming more organized, and with the help of stolen Imperial technology and new alliances with other galactic factions, the humans now had the firepower to make a real stand. Kane's forces had taken over several key Imperial facilities in the heart of Earth's most heavily occupied regions. They had captured high-ranking Imperial officers and used them as leverage in negotiations with other resistance groups across the galaxy, and now Kane himself had become a symbol of rebellion across multiple systems. He had grown beyond just a leader on Earth. He was now seen as the leader of a movement that could tear down the Empire, and all it had built. The human resistance was no longer a fringe group fighting to protect their world. They had become a global and galactic force, capable of challenging the very foundation of the Empire's rule. Vorik watched in horror as the Empire's grip on Earth loosened. He had underestimated humanity. He had believed that their primitive technology and disjointed society would be easy to control, but instead he had ignited a spark that was spreading like wildfire across the stars. Now the Empire was facing a crisis unlike any it had encountered before. Rebellion was no longer a distant threat. It was happening now, and it was happening everywhere. And as Vorik looked out across the galaxy, he realized with a growing sense of dread that the Empire's worst mistake wasn't attacking Earth. It was underestimating the one thing the humans had that no one else had: their unbreakable will to fight for freedom. Admiral Vorik sat in the war room of his flagship, a sense of unease gnawing at him. With each passing day, the situation was deteriorating faster than he could manage. The human resistance on Earth was more organized than ever, and across the galaxy the fires of rebellion were spreading like an unstoppable wave. The once mighty Empire had found itself fighting on too many fronts to maintain control. Vorik's fleet had already suffered significant losses from human sabotage and guerrilla attacks, and now his forces were being stretched thinner than ever, trying to suppress uprisings in multiple systems. At once the Empire's command structure was beginning to fracture, and Vorik was helpless to stop it. He had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and to fight back, and now the consequences were becoming clear. The rebellion had reached a tipping point across Earth, and the galaxy captain Elias Kane had grown into a true leader, not just for the humans on Earth, but for the entire rebellion. His name was now a rallying cry for oppressed worlds. Everywhere, his tactics had become legendary. As he led strikes against the Empire's most fortified positions, he was no longer just a symbol of resistance. He was a force to be reckoned with, and his success had galvanized the rebellious factions across the galaxy who had once been too afraid to rise against the Empire. Now, with Kane's example before them, they fought with a fierce determination and unity that the Empire could not break. On Earth, the resistance was making bold moves to cripple the Empire's presence on the planet. Key Imperial installations were being raided and destroyed one by one. The humans were pushing the Empire back with every attack. The Empire's control of the planet was slipping away faster than Vorik had ever imagined, and it was clear to him now that Earth would not be the easy conquest he had been promised. It would take everything the Empire had to even keep a foothold on the planet, and that was assuming the humans didn't manage to push them off completely. Vorik knew he had to act decisively, but with every attempt to crush the resistance, he only seemed to fuel it further. The humans had proven themselves adaptable, unpredictable, and utterly relentless. They were fighting with a unity the Empire could never hope to match, and now the rebellions across the galaxy were gaining momentum. The very systems the Empire had once dominated were beginning to tear themselves free one by one. The Outer Rim territories that had long been under Imperial rule now found themselves rebelling against their oppressors. Even the once loyal Imperial governors were beginning to question their loyalty as the Empire's strength waned. They knew it was only a matter of time before the revolution reached their own worlds, and that fear began to spread among the Empire's ranks. Vorik had no choice but to escalate the conflict. He sent for reinforcements from the core system's massive dreadnoughts, and legions of soldiers were dispatched to Earth. But it was clear to the Admiral that his forces were no longer invincible. The humans had proven that, and now their war machine was beginning to turn in their favor. The resistance on Earth had found ways to use Imperial technology against the Empire itself. They had intercepted communications and hacked into the Empire's network of satellites and supply lines. They knew the Empire's weaknesses and exploited them with deadly precision. Vorik's orders were growing more desperate as he sought to regain control, but each day seemed to make it harder to retain what little authority the Empire had left. And in the depths of space, a new alliance was beginning to form. The oppressed worlds, the ones who had suffered under the Empire's reign, began to unite under a banner of freedom. Emboldened by the example set by humanity and Captain Kane, the Empire's worst fear had come true. The spark of rebellion had caught fire, and now it was spreading beyond Earth, and the Empire found itself facing a rebellion on a scale it had never anticipated. The Imperial war machine was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance, and for the first time Admiral Vorik was forced to confront the reality that the Empire was losing, and humanity had shown the galaxy that they could rise up and fight back against the most powerful force in the known universe. The final battle for Earth loomed on the horizon. Admiral Vorik's fleet had been reinforced, but it no longer mattered. The resistance had grown too powerful, and humanity's will to fight had become something the Empire could no longer crush. No matter how many ships they sent or how many soldiers they deployed, Vorik knew the humans were no longer simply fighting for survival. They were fighting for something far greater: their freedom, their future, and the future of all those oppressed by the Empire. And this time the Admiral could no longer deny it. The tide had turned. Captain Elias Kane stood at the front of the final assault with his Galactic forces by his side. The war had stretched on longer than anyone had anticipated, but they had never stopped fighting. The human resistance had become a full-fledged army. Their tactics were unmatched, and their resolve was unbreakable. The Empire had thrown everything they had at them, and yet the humans were still standing. Now the final blow was about to be struck, as Kane led his forces in a coordinated assault on the last remaining Imperial stronghold on Earth. The battle was brutal, but it was clear that the humans were winning. Every attack felt like it could be their last, but they fought through it with a fire that never waned. The Empire's once indomitable forces were being pushed back, as they had been time and time again across the planet and beyond. The Empire's fleet in orbit was now in disarray as the human forces launched their final strike. The same guerrilla tactics that had served them so well on the ground were now being applied in space. The humans had infiltrated the Empire's own ships using stolen technology and their own cunning to disable the mighty warships from within. One by one, Imperial dreadnoughts fell as the human resistance used everything at their disposal to tear apart the fleet from the inside. The once mighty armada that had been sent to conquer Earth was now being destroyed by the very species it had thought to enslave. As the battle on Earth reached its climax, Vorik found himself facing a hard truth. The Empire could no longer win, not against a species that had fought so fiercely, not against a people who had proven themselves capable of things the Empire had never expected. His once loyal officers were now questioning their orders. Mutiny was in the air. The shockwaves of rebellion had reached the heart of the Empire itself, and Vorik realized that it was only a matter of time before the Imperial reign collapsed. In the ruins of what had once been a symbol of Imperial power, Captain Kane stood victorious. The final stronghold had fallen and Earth had been liberated. The human resistance had not only freed their own world, but had ignited a revolution that was now sweeping across the galaxy. The Empire had crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance, and humanity had proven once and for all that no matter how powerful the enemy, no matter how great the odds, they would never bow, they would never break. As Kane looked up at the stars, he knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over yet, but humanity had shown the galaxy that they could stand tall and face whatever came next. No longer would they be underestimated, no longer would they be thought of as weak. The humans had changed the course of history, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Admiral Vorik watched the last of his fleet burn in the distance, knowing that his worst mistake had not been attacking Earth, but underestimating humanity's unyielding will to survive and to fight for freedom.